Hi, and welcome to a presentation by Start Science. We will be going over heterogeneous versus homogeneous mixtures today. So I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Camille, and I study biology at York University in Canada. A few fun facts about me are that I love cooking and playing sports. So we'll start by getting right into our topic. So we'll first go into some theory. So what is a mixture? And then once we understand this, we can differentiate between heterogeneous and homogeneous mixtures. And then we'll move on to our activity in which we'll do a fun little chemistry experiment. So what is a mixture? So we can define a mixture as a combination of two or more substances. So in this picture, we see on the right, blue and yellow paint being mixed together and resulting in a green paint. We also have pizza on this slide. So to make pizza, we use pizza dough, we use tomato sauce, pepperonis, mushrooms, and any toppings of your choice. And similarly, for soup, you can add pasta, beans, vegetables, and more. So all three of these would be considered mixtures since we're adding two or more substances together. So now I want you to just take 30 seconds to brainstorm some ideas of mixtures on your own. So just pause the video, or you can think of it as we go through the next slide. As we know, matter can actually exist in three different states, so either as a solid, as a liquid, or as a gas. Some differences between them is that solids tend to have little space between their particles. Liquids do have some space between their particles, a bit more than solids do, and then gas have very spaced out particles, even more so than liquids or solids. Another difference between the three is that the solid will not fill the shape of the container it is in, whereas the liquid and the gas will. So we can see these principles illustrated on the figure to our right. So what's important in all of this is that mixtures can actually consist of any state of matter. So mixtures can have solids, they can have liquids, and they can have gases. And if this topic actually interests you, we do have a video diving deeper into what is matter on our website as well. But this simple explanation works for what we are doing today. So here's some example of mixtures that I came up with. So first off here we have air. So air is composed of nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. So these three substances are present in the gaseous form. My next example is with blood. So blood is composed of white blood cells, of red blood cells, of platelets, and of plasma. So white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets are solid components of blood, and the plasma is the liquid component. And my final example is with tea. So tea can have water, a tea bag with components inside, and honey. So water and honey here are liquids, whereas the components of the tea bag are solids. So now that we understand what a mixture is, we'll dive into heterogeneous mixtures, and you may actually know of these as mechanical mixtures. So these obviously have two or more substances to them, as we saw in our definition of mixture. And when we mix these substances together, you can still differentiate between them. So there's two distinct layers. So in this picture, for example, we see that there's two layers. So this is how we tell that there's two substances in this mixture. So now I want you to try to once again think of some examples of heterogeneous mixtures that you may know of. So here's some examples that I thought of. So with sand and water, no matter how much you try to mix both of them together, the sand will always sink under the water. We also see when trying to mix salt and pepper together in food seasoning that we'll always be able to differentiate between the salt and the pepper particles. Our next topic is homogeneous mixtures. So this is the opposite of heterogeneous mixtures. So when we try to mix these substances together, we can no longer tell the substances apart. And then once we've mixed them, it's hard to separate them. And here it's also important to distinguish that a pure substance and a homogeneous mixture is not the same thing. So a pure substance will be composed of only one compound or one chemical element. So water, for example, which is only composed of H2O molecules on its own. Whereas as we saw, a mixture, so a homogeneous mixture, would be two compounds or more. So just by this number of compounds involved, we can tell a difference between both of them. So now that we've gone over this, I want you to once again just pause the video and try to brainstorm some ideas of homogeneous mixtures on your own. So here's what I thought of. So when you mix salt with water, you'll no longer be able to see the salt particles anymore, as long as you don't add too much to the water. So if you're actually curious about what happens, I suggest that you try this experiment. So just oversaturate your water with salt, which means to add lots and lots and lots of salt. And then you'll see if this is still a homogeneous mixture. And my second example here is steel. So steel is composed of both iron and carbon. So now that we've gone over the material, I'll just be asking you a few review questions. So first, I'll ask you, what is the difference between a homogeneous and a heterogeneous mixture? And if you're not sure, or if you need a refresher, I suggest that you go back in the video. But feel free to pause the video to think about each of the questions I will be going over. And there's a hint on each slide to help you out. Now, my second question is, which states of matter can be present in mixtures? So now we'll be diving right into our experiment and apply what we've just learned. So our goal will be to identify which substances produce heterogeneous mixtures and which substances produce homogeneous mixtures. So these are the material that we'll be needing. So a cup of room temperature water, a quarter cup of both cold tap water and hot tap water. So we can get those right when we start that experiment, just so that the water doesn't become room temperature. We also need a tablespoon of oil, a tablespoon of either milk or juice, a teaspoon of sugar, half a teaspoon of black pepper, 2 tablespoons of soil sample. And if you don't have this is not a problem. And finally, a clear glass or a plastic cup in which we'll be doing each of the experiments. Okay, so just take a minute to gather all of the material you will be needing, and we'll be moving right into the experiments. So here's just a few safety rules first. I'll let you read these on your own, but it's very important that you don't eat or drink any of the mixtures that we're going to be making during this activity. Just tie back your long hair and discard the solutions in the sink when you've completed the solutions. And I'll actually just tell you when we get to the oil mixture, there's a different step here that we have to do. So through the experiments, you will be filling out this table. So please just make sure to write it down. And we'll be filling out the hypothesis, the observations, and the results for each mixture. So the hypothesis is what you expect will happen. So will the two compounds form a heterogeneous or a homogeneous mixture? So we can fill out this column now. Our observations will be what you see when we're doing the experiment. So are there any bubbles? Are there layers forming? Anything changing or unusual really? And our results will just be whether the mixture is heterogeneous or homogeneous. So just take a minute to pause and write down the table and the hypothesis for each mixture. Okay, so now that we have all our materials and we've started out with our table, we can go right into our first mixture. So we'll be adding a tablespoon of oil to a quarter cup of room temperature water in our glass. And when we've done this, we can just mix our substances together for 30 seconds and then leave it untouched for a minute. So I'll let you pause the video after each experiment to do these last two steps. So just mixing the substances together and then leaving it untouched for a minute. And then we'll conclude together whether the mixture is homogeneous or heterogeneous. This is what I have for the water and oil. So here, what I'm seeing is that there's a layer of oil forming at the top and the water is on the bottom, and that the two of them are not mixing. So do you think that this means it's a heterogeneous mixture or a homogeneous one? So you should think that this is a heterogeneous mixture, right? Okay. And just a note before we will be moving on, we actually don't want to put oil down the drain. So we will be soaking the oil out of the solution when we're done with a paper towel or a napkin. So just try to gather as much oil as you can, and then we can throw this paper towel out in the garbage and then just discard the water left in the sink. Our next experiment is with our water and either a tablespoon of juice or a tablespoon of milk. So I'll be using milk here, so you can just pour the milk in there. And once again, I invite you to pause the video just to mix your substances together for 30 seconds and then leave the substances to rest for a minute. So what we should see when this is done, this is what I have using my milk and water. So I see a single layer. I don't see any milk or water particles really. Right? So what does this tell us? Is this heterogeneous or is it homogeneous? So I would say this is homogeneous. And if you've used juice, what do you see? Is it heterogeneous or homogeneous? And you should be seeing that's also homogeneous. Our next experiment, we can now go get our warm tap water. Okay? So we'll just be pouring half a teaspoon of sugar into the water. And then once we've done this, and when we've gotten our 30 seconds and our minute left, so just pause the video to do that. But what we are seeing at the end is something like this. So I'm just seeing water. I'm not seeing any sugar particles, no matter what angle I'm looking at it from. So what do you see in your glass? I would conclude that this is most likely homogeneous, right? We'll just be writing that down in our table, just as we've been doing with the other experiments. Our next one is using our cold tap water in the sugar. So once again, just go get your cold tap water now, okay? And then when you've come back, just pour your sugar in and stir it and leave it untouched for a minute. So just pause the video right now. And then when you come back, what you should be seeing is that there's a bit of sugar particles just laying at the bottom of the glass. So it might be hard to see in my camera, but I have a bit of sugar on the bottom. So does this tell us it's heterogeneous or homogeneous? So we would say heterogeneous, right? Since we're able to distinguish between the sugar and the water. Alright, next one is with water and pepper. So we can just use a pepper grinder and just sprinkle some pepper into our water. And once again, just pause the video, mix the substances together for 30 seconds, and then leave it untouched for a minute. So what we are seeing here is that there's a bit of pepper laying on the bottom of my glass. There's also a bit laying on the top of the water, and there's some pepper floating in the water itself. So do we think this is heterogeneous or homogeneous? So I would say heterogeneous, right? Even though the pepper molecules are dispersed evenly in the water, I'm still able to see where the pepper is. So this might be an observation that we could write in the table. So the pepper is evenly distributed. Our final experiment is with our soil sample. So if you have some, just take a look at your sample. So this is my sample right here. But I invite you to look at the picture on the slide. So what do we see on the slide? Is it heterogeneous or homogeneous? So what I'm looking at, I see some rocks, I see little sticks, I see some dirt. So I would say that this is heterogeneous, right? Since I'm able to tell the rocks, the sticks, and the dirt apart. So what we want to do now with our soil is that we can either put it back where we found it, so either in our plants or outside, if it's not contaminated. If we have contaminated it with our other mixtures, we might just want to throw it out in the garbage or in our compost instead if we have one. And this is because we actually do not want to be hurting any organisms that come in contact with the soil. Okay, so now just to wrap up our experiment, we'll be reflecting on a few more questions. So I just want you to pause the video after I finish reading each question. Then we'll be going over the answers together. So, what did our results with sugar tell us about how water temperature affects whether the mixture is heterogeneous or homogeneous? So what we should see is that hotter temperatures make it easier for substances to dissolve in the liquid. So with the sugar, we saw that it dissolved pretty quickly in the hot water, but it did not really dissolve in the cold water. And this is because with hot temperatures, there's more collisions between the sugar and the water. Whereas with the cold water, there's less collisions. So the sugar appeared to stay clumped. And we can then conclude that warm water is better for dissolving other substances. My next question for you is, what happened when you mixed a solid substance with water? And what happened when you mixed a liquid substance with water? And I invite you to just look at the results we got from our own experiments to conclude the answer for this. And you should see that it really depends on the compounds used for the mixture. So in our case, the liquids mixed with water either gave a heterogeneous or a homogeneous mixture. So mixing oil with water gave a heterogeneous mixture, right? And then mixing water with milk or water with juice gave a homogeneous mixture. And then it was the same thing when we added solids with our water. So there was the water and the sugar. When the water was warm, we saw that the sugar dissolved and that it was a homogeneous mixture. With the pepper and the water, we saw that it was a heterogeneous mixture. So based on the experiments we did, there's no clear pattern, and this is because it depends on the properties of the substances mixed. And lastly, my final question is, why did we stir the solution after adding the second substance? And the answer is that when you stir the solution, it actually helps to break down the compound you're adding to the liquid. And it's also helping to make sure that the compound is evenly distributed from the top to the bottom of the glass. So this way, the way it settles down is not because of the order in which the compounds were put, but it's basically due to the properties and the interactions between both compounds. So I want to thank you so much for your participation in this experiment. I really hope that you had fun and that perhaps you learned something. And if you have questions or any comments, please feel free to contact Start Science at the email written there. And if you want to learn about more fun science topics, look through the website. And here's just the sources I use for all my slides.